At my father-in-law's birthday party, I accidentally spilled wine on him. He punched me in the face, blood splattered on the floor, and screamed, "Stupid maid. Clean my shirt." My husband demanded, "Apologize or leave." So I left, but when they returned home, there were 68 missed calls. Can you imagine being punched by your father-in-law in front of dozens of Boston's elite, only for your own husband to turn to you and say, "Apologize or get out"? My blood was still on their pristine marble floor when I walked out that night. But that was just the beginning. 68 missed calls later, they thought they could silence me. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. It started like every other forced family gathering. Boston in the winter has a way of biting through even the thickest coat, and that night, the cold outside the Corwin mansion felt like a cruel reflection of the atmosphere inside. Their house wasn't a home. It was a white stone monument, every light blazing, daring the world to see how much they had. I adjusted my coat, forcing the polite smile I'd practiced 1,000 times. This wasn't just my husband Alaric's family, it was his kingdom, and I was just a visitor. The warmth inside hit me, but it was quickly overshadowed by the low hum of classical music and the clinking of crystal glasses. The kind of laughter that sounded rehearsed. I recognized the faces, Boston's upper crust, society pages, charity galas. But they never really looked at me. Just glances, whispers, their eyes sliding off me like I wasn't worth focusing on. 3 years of this. 3 years of biting my tongue. Of letting the quiet jabs roll off my back. 3 years of convincing myself that if I just tried harder, if I just stayed calm, they'd eventually accept me. Tonight, I told myself, had to be different. It had to be. Alaric was already across the room, a proud soldier next to his father, Dorian. They looked alike, tall, sharp features, the kind of confidence that comes from knowing the world bends for people like them. He didn't even notice me at first. That's how it usually was. I made small talk with a woman I barely knew, nodding as she spoke of Aspen ski trips and private chefs, but my mind drifted. All those years, all those attempts. Dinner was served at the long mahogany table, the kind where no one really eats, but everyone performs. I kept my head down, smiled when appropriate, even laughed softly at jokes I didn't find funny. God, I tried. And then it happened. So fast. I was carrying a glass of red wine, walking behind Dorian to pass a plate. My heel snagged on the ornate rug. Just a moment, a slip, and the wine splashed across his crisp white shirt. The room went silent. Not a comforting silence, a strangling one. Dorian turned slowly, his face twisted with pure disgust. Before I could even open my mouth, his fist connected with my cheek. Hard. The shock hit me before the pain, then the warm rush of blood filling my mouth, the metallic taste spreading across my tongue. I stumbled back, my hand flying to my face. "You stupid maid." His voice boomed, filling every corner of the room. "Wash my damn shirt." I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at him, while a room of 50 people watched like it was theater. Some looked away, some smirked, but no one said a word. My gaze frantically searched for Alaric, my husband. The man I thought would protect me, or at least try. He didn't rush to me. He didn't look horrified. He just stood there, his face cold, utterly unreadable. "Apologize to my father," he said evenly, his voice like a gavel. "Or get out." Something in me cracked then, not from the physical pain, but from the searing betrayal. The man I married, the man I thought would choose me, had just picked his father over his wife, without a second's hesitation. I tasted the blood again, felt it dripping slowly onto the polished marble floor, and suddenly I couldn't stay there another second. There was a silk napkin on the table. I picked it up, wiped my mouth carefully, and straightened my back. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I didn't apologize. I just turned and walked out. Each step echoed against the marble as if to say, "I'm done." The cold night hit me like a slap. My car was parked at the end of the long driveway, its windshield already frosted over. I slid inside, my hands trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. For a moment, I just sat there, breathing, tasting blood and humiliation. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. Snowflakes hitting the windshield. City lights bleeding into one another. My thoughts replaying the scene on a loop. By the time I got home, my phone had been buzzing nonstop. I kicked off my shoes, dropped my coat on the couch, and finally looked at the screen. 68 missed calls. Alaric. Dorian. Back to back. I didn't answer a single one, but when I finally opened one of the texts, my hands went cold. I sat on the edge of my bed, the same spot I always collapsed into after long days. Except this wasn't just another long day. My apartment felt smaller than usual. Its soft light unable to push away the shadows that had crept in with me. The Corwin mansion still clung to me, its glitter, its judgment, the sting of its polished cruelty. Here, my little two-bedroom was supposed to be a safe harbor. But even home can feel hostile when your phone won't stop buzzing. I picked it up again, though I'd promised myself I wouldn't. 68 calls, dozens of unread texts. It wasn't just persistence, it was pressure. I scrolled through them slowly, each notification hitting me like a pulse I didn't want to feel. Pick up. Let's talk. That was Alaric, one of the first. You embarrassed my family, Dorian. Calliope, don't make this worse than it already is, Alaric again. You'll regret it if you talk, Dorian. The words blurred after a while. Apologies disguised as orders. Warnings dressed as concern. I read them twice, maybe 3 times, as if understanding their tone could make them less venomous. But it didn't. It never did. Then I saw it. A voicemail. I hadn't noticed it before, tucked in between the waves of missed calls. My thumb hovered over it. Part of me wanted to delete it, to pretend it didn't exist, but I pressed play. Dorian's voice came through, smooth, controlled, the same way he'd talk to a contractor or a waiter he wanted to intimidate without raising his voice. Calliope, accidents happen. But if you try to make this into something bigger, I'll make sure you regret it. I have the best lawyers in Boston. Think carefully, Calliope. My breath caught. Not because I didn't expect it, but because he didn't even bother hiding it. There it was, laid bare, threats wrapped in civility, power humming just beneath his words. I stared at the phone in my hand for what felt like forever. The old me, the one who spent 3 years enduring dinner table jabs, who bit her tongue through every whispered insult, would have cried. Would have called Alaric. Would have tried to explain herself, to make it right, to shrink smaller and hope they'd forget about me. But I didn't do that. Instead, I leaned back against the headboard and let my mind drift somewhere else. To my mother. It had been years since I lost her, but sometimes her voice came back like a faint melody I couldn't unhear. Never let them see you break, she used to say that when I'd come home from school, tears hidden badly behind a practiced smile. People like that, they feed on it. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone tighter. What would she say if she saw me tonight? If she saw me bleeding on that marble floor while everyone else just watched? I remembered another dinner months ago, when Dorian told the table I was lucky to be married into the family considering where I came from. And Alaric didn't say a word. He just kept eating, like swallowing his father's cruelty was easier than defending his wife. That memory had been buried deep. Tonight, it clawed its way back. I pushed myself up and walked to the small desk by the window. It was cluttered, old bills, unopened mail, a half-burned candle. And beneath it, hidden under a stack of takeout menus, was a notebook. I hadn't touched it in a long time. It started as a diary, but somewhere along the way, it became something else. A ledger. A record of every slight, every insult Dorian had ever thrown my way. At first, I didn't even know why I kept it. Maybe for my sanity. Maybe because some part of me knew this day would come. I flipped through the pages slowly. Dinner comments, phone calls, the time he joked about having me sign a prenup after we were already married. My handwriting was shaky at first, then sharper, more deliberate. This wasn't just therapy. This was evidence. The phone buzzed again on the bed. I didn't move to get it. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, poured myself a glass of water, and stared at the napkin I'd taken from the party. It was still stained, a deep, ugly red against the pale silk. I held it in my hands for a long time. A stupid piece of fabric, but it felt like a turning point, like a reminder that I couldn't keep being the woman who swallowed her pain in silence. This ends soon, I whispered to no one. The words were barely audible, but real enough to make my chest tighten. I turned off my phone. No more buzzing, no more voices, just silence. But it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence before a storm. And I had no idea just how far they'd go to keep me quiet. And when I found out, something inside me finally snapped. Morning light crept through the blinds, thin and pale, like it didn't want to wake me. Not that I'd really slept. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the city waking up beyond my window. Delivery trucks, distant voices. The world moved on as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't been bleeding on polished marble while a room full of people watched like it was entertainment. My phone buzzed again on the nightstand. I didn't even look. The rhythm of those vibrations had become its own kind of torture. Alaric's name, sometimes Dorian. I didn't need to see the words to know the tone. I'd heard it all before. Instead, I got up. My body felt heavy, like it belonged to someone else, but I moved anyway. In the kitchen, I poured stale coffee from yesterday into a mug and heated it in the microwave. The silence in my apartment felt safer than their voices, but it was only skin deep. I opened my laptop more out of habit than purpose. I wanted to distract myself, maybe catch up on work, bury myself in something that didn't involve the Corwins. But the first thing I saw wasn't my inbox. It was an email. From Mr. Corwin. Your silence is expected. Any attempt to escalate this incident will result in consequences for you and your marriage. It was from his assistant, not even him. He didn't need to get his hands dirty when someone else could do it for him. I stared at it for a long time, reading it over and over like maybe it would change, but it didn't. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just about what he'd done at that party. It was about control. Keeping me in my place. Making sure I stayed quiet, invisible, compliant. And Alaric. Alaric knew. I thought of him, the way he stood there, stone-faced, while his father called me a stupid maid. He told me to apologize. Apologize? Like I was the one who crossed the line. Like my blood on their floor was an inconvenience for him. My hands trembled on the keyboard, but not from fear. Not entirely. It was something deeper, something that had been building for a long time. I closed my eyes and a different memory came back, uninvited. A dinner months ago, an upscale restaurant in the city, one of Dorian's favorites, the kind where you can smell the money in the air. I remembered the way the candlelight reflected off Dorian's cufflinks as he sat across from me, watching like a hawk, while Alaric slid a folded document across the table. Just legal housekeeping, Alaric had said, his voice casual, like he was asking me to sign for a package. I'd looked at him confused. What is this? A prenuptial amendment, he'd explained. Nothing major, just clarifying some things. It's for everyone's protection. Everyone. He meant his family, not me. I'd felt the weight of Dorian's gaze pressing down on me. He didn't say a word, but his smirk said everything. I wasn't his daughter-in-law. I was an outsider being reminded of my place. And I signed it. I hated remembering that. Hated knowing how small I'd made myself. How desperate I was to keep Alaric from slipping away. I thought compliance would buy me safety. I thought playing along would make me part of them. All it did was hand them the tools to destroy me. The anger hit me then, sharp and clean. I walked back to my desk, the same one where I'd found the notebook last night. I pulled it out again, flipping past the messy entries of insults and dinners gone wrong. This time I turned to a blank page. Document everything, I wrote at the top. My handwriting was steady now. Names, dates, words. It felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Then I reached for the small drawer on the side of the desk. Inside was a USB drive, tucked away under years of forgotten receipts. I'd labeled it in case. It was a habit from my old life, before the Corwins. A way to protect myself when I felt the ground beneath me might give out. I held it in my palm for a long time, feeling its weight. If they wanted silence, they picked the wrong woman. But first, I needed to confront the one person I thought I could still trust. It took me nearly an hour to draft the text. Every version sounded either too angry or too desperate, but eventually I sent it. Meet me. No, Dorian, no excuses. His reply came quickly, almost too quickly. Where? That told me everything. He wasn't coming to apologize. He was coming to control the narrative. I chose a coffee shop in Cambridge, neutral ground. Somewhere he couldn't raise his voice without attracting attention. When I got there, the smell of roasted beans and old wood hit me like a wall. It was quiet for a Saturday morning, the kind of place where people came to work in silence, laptops glowing between half-drunk cappuccinos. I picked a table by the window and sat with my back straight, my fingers wrapped around a mug I hadn't touched. He walked in 10 minutes later, still in one of his tailored suits, though his tie was loose, as if that made him more approachable. For a second, I almost forgot why we were here. Almost. "Calliope," he said, like it was some kind of olive branch. "Alaric." I didn't offer a smile. I didn't stand. He sat across from me, folding his hands on the table like a man preparing for cross-examination. It struck me then. He wasn't here as my husband. He was here as Dorian Corwin's son. "Let's talk," he said. I leaned forward. "Why didn't you do anything?" He hit me, "Alaric, in front of everyone. And you just stood there." His gaze darted to the table, to the window, anywhere but me. "It was an accident." He was drunk. "You know how my dad gets when he drinks." I felt something inside me splinter. "An accident? Are you kidding me?" He called me a stupid maid, Alaric. That wasn't just his hand. That was everything he thinks of me in one moment. He sighed like I was being difficult. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be. If I just what?" My voice came out sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. "If I just smile and pretend it didn't happen? If I just let your father humiliate me whenever he wants?" That got his attention. He finally looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw it. Not guilt, not remorse. Fear. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "My dad controls everything. The trust, the business, even parts of my career. If you push him, we both lose everything." The words echoed in my head. We both lose everything. That was what this was really about. Not my dignity, not my safety. His career, his money, his father's approval. "Would you let anyone hit your sister and get away with it?" I asked, my voice trembling. But not from fear, from rage. "Why is it different for me? Why am I the one who has to bend?" He rubbed his temples. "Because this isn't just about you. This is about keeping the peace." I laughed then, a bitter, hollow sound I barely recognized as my own. "Keeping the peace? You mean keeping your father happy?" His expression hardened. "If you love me, you'll make peace with him. Apologize and we can move forward." Apologize. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room. He reached for my hand, but I pulled back. That was it. The last chord between us snapped, quiet, but final. I stood up, my chair scraped against the floor, loud in the otherwise silent room. He started to say my name, but I didn't let him finish. "If staying married to you means surrendering to him," I said, my voice steady, "then I'll lose everything before I lose myself." I walked out without looking back, the winter air burning my face as I stepped outside. And that's when I decided, if Alaric wouldn't fight for me, I'd fight for myself. But I needed allies, and I knew exactly where to find them. By the time I made it back to my apartment, the winter sky had darkened into that hollow gray that always seemed to hang over Boston. The place smelled faintly of stale coffee and loneliness. I dropped my bag by the door and sat on the edge of my couch, staring at the blinking light on my phone. More messages, more voicemails, more threats. I couldn't bring myself to press play. I leaned back and closed my eyes, letting the silence swallow me. But it wasn't silent. Not really. It was filled with echoes. Don't let anyone convince you silence is the same as peace. My mother's voice, so soft but unshakable, came back to me like she was sitting right beside me. I could almost see her, apron dusted with flour, hair falling out of its pins. She used to say that when I'd come home from school with red eyes and clenched fists, unwilling to tell her what had happened. "Silence doesn't protect you, Calliope. It just keeps you invisible." For a moment, I wanted to believe she was wrong. That if I kept my head down, if I swallowed it all like I had for years, it would eventually get easier. But then my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Alaric or Dorian. It was a message from an old friend, one of the few people who still dared to keep in touch after I'd married into the Corwins. "Be careful," the text read. I heard Dorian's prepping a defamation suit. He wants to scare you into staying quiet. I read it 3 times before it sank in. They weren't just trying to humiliate me anymore. They wanted to erase me. Something inside me broke then, not in the way that shatters you, but in the way that finally wakes you up. I slid off the couch onto the floor and hugged my knees, letting the tears come. Not just for the party, not just for the sting of Dorian's fist or Alaric's coldness, but for every dinner where my voice had been drowned out by their polished laughter. For every time I'd convinced myself that enduring their contempt was keeping the peace. I don't know how long I stayed like that. The room grew darker, the city outside quieter, until the only sound was my own uneven breathing. When I finally stood, my body felt heavier, like I'd been carrying the Corwin name on my back all these years without even realizing it. I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. I wasn't sure what I was looking for. Maybe help, maybe a sign. My fingers moved almost on their own, searching for legal aid, typing out words like free consultation and domestic abuse legal resources. That's when I found it, a community legal clinic in the heart of Boston. Evening hours. Walk-ins welcome. I hesitated. I was still in yesterday's clothes, my hair a mess, my makeup smudged from tears I hadn't even bothered to wipe away. But what was I going to do? Sit here and wait for Dorian to bury me? I grabbed my coat and left. The clinic wasn't glamorous. It was tucked between a laundromat and a discount shoe store, the kind of place you'd pass without noticing. Inside, it smelled of paper and old carpet, with posters about tenant rights peeling slightly at the edges. I almost turned around, but then a voice called out, "Can I help you?" She was older, maybe in her late 60s, with sharp eyes that seemed to notice everything and a voice that carried the kind of authority you don't earn from a title, but from surviving life itself. I need advice, I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. Sit, she said simply, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Her name was Marjorie, a retired attorney who now volunteered at the clinic. I told her everything, or at least as much as I could manage without falling apart again. She didn't interrupt. She didn't give me the pitying looks I'd grown used to. She just listened. When I finally stopped talking, she leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "You're not crazy. You're in a system designed to break you, but I've seen men like Dorian fall before." Her words cut through me, not like a knife, but like light. I didn't know if I believed her, but for the first time since that night at the mansion, I felt something other than despair. I left the clinic with Marjorie's card in my pocket and her words echoing in my head. I've seen men like Dorian fall before. If that was true, I was going to make sure Dorian Corwin was next. The next morning felt different. Not lighter. No. The weight was still there, but it was the kind you start lifting on purpose. I woke up with a plan forming in my head. One shaky but real step at a time. I made myself breakfast, an actual meal, not the stale crackers I'd been surviving on since that night. 2 scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee that wasn't reheated from the day before. It wasn't much, but it felt like reclaiming something. By mid-morning, I was back at the legal clinic. Marjorie was already there, sifting through papers behind her desk like a woman who hadn't really retired. She looked up when I walked in, her sharp eyes softening for a second before snapping back to their usual steel. "You came back," she said, as though she'd been expecting me. "I can't do this alone," I admitted, sliding into the chair across from her. "No one can," she replied simply. "Let's talk options." We spent the next hour going over what needed to be done, filing for a restraining order, documenting every single incident of abuse, even the ones I'd tried to convince myself weren't bad enough to matter. She kept telling me, patterns matter more than single events. "You've been in a system of control, Calliope. The more we can prove it, the harder it is for him to spin this." Then she leaned back, crossed her arms, and said something that caught me off guard. "You should know this isn't my first time dealing with Dorian Corwin." I blinked. "What do you mean?" "Years ago, I represented one of his employees, a man who stood up to him after being harassed at work. Dorian blacklisted him, ruined his career. We lost the case because Dorian buried us in legal maneuvering, but..." She tapped her desk, a small smirk forming. "I still have the documentation. Old records, letters, evidence of how far he'll go when he thinks someone's a threat." My pulse quickened. You kept it? Marjorie nodded. I don't throw away things that might be useful later, and Dorian Corwin always leaves a trail. For the first time, it felt like we weren't just playing defense. After leaving the clinic, I headed to the public library. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. But sitting in that quiet space, surrounded by the hum of computers and the smell of old paper, I felt calmer, like I belonged somewhere again. I dug through public records, combing through years of business filings, charity reports, property ownership records. It was tedious, but then I saw it. A property transfer made under Dorian's name just days before the party. A luxury condo in Beacon Hill moved into a trust with no clear beneficiary. It looked like an attempt to hide assets. I took out my phone and photographed everything. As I was gathering my things, my phone buzzed. Alaric, stop this madness before you ruin us all. His text read. I stared at it for a long moment. A week ago, that would have gutted me. Today, it made me laugh. Short, cold, and humorless. I wasn't afraid of his warnings anymore. That night, I sat with Marjorie again in her office. We spread out everything on the table. Her old files, my photos, a growing list of dates, names, and connections. When you fight someone like Dorian, she said, sliding her glasses down to meet my eyes, you don't aim to win the first round. You aim to end the war. Her words echoed in my head long after I left. For the first time since all of this began, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Not because I was falling, but because I'd planted my feet. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was building something bigger, a case, a weapon. And for the first time in weeks, I wasn't the prey. I was the hunter. But I didn't realize Dorian had already set his trap for me. The pounding on my door came before sunrise. At first, I thought it was a neighbor. Maybe a delivery left at the wrong apartment. But when I opened it, a man in a heavy overcoat stood there with an envelope in hand. His voice clipped and practiced. Are you Calliope Corwin? The way he said it made my stomach twist. Yes, you've been served. He pressed the envelope into my hands, turned, and left before I could form words. I stood in the doorway barefoot, the cold air from the hall creeping in as I stared at the papers like they might burn me. Defamation. Restraining order. My knees nearly gave out as I sat on the couch and flipped through page after page of legal jargon. The words didn't feel real. Unstable, vindictive, posing a threat to the Corwin family's reputation. They'd painted me like a deranged stranger, not a wife, not a daughter-in-law, not a human being. The restraining order made it worse. I wasn't allowed near Dorian. I wasn't allowed at any family properties. And I certainly wasn't welcome at any Corwin-related events. They'd carved me out of the family like I was a stain they could scrub off. My fingers shook as I grabbed my phone and dialed Alaric. He answered after the second ring, his voice flat. You brought this on yourself, he said before I could speak. He warned you, Calliope. I told you to let this go. Alaric, your father hit me. He humiliated me in front of everyone. And now he's trying to destroy me in court. And you. My voice broke, but not from tears, from disbelief. You're fine with this? There was a pause, then that same quiet, clipped tone. I can't get between you and my father. You've made your choices now. Live with them. He hung up. I stared at the phone like it might explain how the man I married could sound so much like a stranger. The papers blurred as I tried to reread them. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a character assassination. They'd gone for my credibility, my sanity, my entire sense of self. It felt like every whisper I'd endured at their dinner table had been turned into evidence. Emotional instability, disruptive behavior, vindictive personality. I wanted to rip it all up. I wanted to scream. But instead, I grabbed my keys and drove to Marjorie's. She didn't need me to explain. One look at me holding those papers, and she ushered me into her office, her eyes blazing. Let me guess, she said, flipping through the stack. They're trying to make you look like the problem. They're saying I'm unstable, that I'm out for revenge, that I'm... The words were sticking in my throat. Marjorie's mouth pressed into a thin line as she reached for a folder on her desk. Calliope, I need you to brace yourself. I pulled some strings and found out how they're backing this up. I nodded, though I already felt the weight of what was coming. They bribed one of the former housekeepers, she said finally. Paid her to testify that you've had violent outbursts, that you've threatened Dorian before. For a moment, I couldn't speak. The room tilted and I had to grip the edge of the chair to ground myself. They're building a case to make you look dangerous, Marjorie said softly. It's ugly, but this is what men like Dorian do when they're scared. I let out a bitter laugh. So, he gets to hit me, destroy my name, and walk away like the victim. Marjorie leaned forward. That's what he thinks. But Calliope, listen to me. People like him don't do this unless they feel threatened. You're getting to him. That means you keep going. Her words should have comforted me, but I felt hollow. The idea of standing in a courtroom while they dragged my name through the mud made me want to disappear. For one wild moment, I considered packing a bag, leaving Boston, and never looking back. No one would blame me for running. No one would even notice I was gone. But then I saw my reflection in Marjorie's office window. Tired, battered, but still there. Still me. If they're willing to bury me like this, I said quietly, then they know I can hurt them. Marjorie gave a small, fierce nod. Exactly. And now we show them they picked the wrong woman. I walked out of that office with my hand still trembling. But for the first time that day, it wasn't from fear. It was from something else entirely. They wanted to bury me. Instead, they just lit the fire. And I was ready to burn everything they thought untouchable. It started in Marjorie's office a week before Christmas. Her space was as cluttered as ever, files stacked high, half-drunk mugs of tea abandoned across her desk. I handed her the folder of documents I'd been compiling for weeks. Bank records, property transfers, correspondence that should have stayed private, but hadn't. She leafed through them silently, the faint smile on her lips betraying her thoughts. This, she finally said, tapping a particular document, is going to set him on fire. Are you ready for that? Because once we do this, there's no going back. I'd been asked that question before, by myself, in the quiet of my apartment every night since Dorian served me those papers. And every time, my answer became clearer. There's nothing left to go back to, I said. Marjorie's eyes softened for a moment. Then let's scorch the earth. We mapped it out carefully. No impulsive moves, no emotional outbursts. I had one shot to hit him where it hurt, his image. Dorian lived for his reputation in Boston's elite circles. Destroying it would be the one wound he couldn't stitch up with money. I spent 2 sleepless nights drafting anonymous emails to investigative journalists. Each one contained the files, proof of his fraudulent property transfers, whispers of money laundering hidden under layers of corporate jargon. I scheduled them to go live at exactly 8 a.m. on Christmas Eve, during his charity gala. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. He'd planned a night of polished speeches and cameras catching him play the benevolent tycoon. Instead, I'd turn it into the night his empire cracked in front of everyone who mattered to him. On the evening of the gala, I stood in front of my mirror longer than I'd care to admit. I chose a simple black dress, nothing flashy, but sharp enough to make them notice. It wasn't about beauty. It was about reclaiming the dignity they'd stripped from me. The ballroom was everything I expected. Glittering chandeliers, white-draped tables, and the scent of wealth and old money perfuming the air. I hadn't been invited, but no one stopped me. The Corwins had always been good at pretending. Alaric found me before I even reached the center of the room. He looked paler than I'd ever seen him. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, grabbing my arm. I pulled away calmly, watching the show. His jaw clenched. "Calliope, this isn't the way." "It's the only way." I didn't wait for his response. Across the room, Dorian stood at the podium, radiating smug confidence as he thanked donors for helping the less fortunate. His voice boomed over the microphone, and I wondered if anyone else could hear the rot beneath those words. Then it happened. At 8:03 p.m., his phone lit up. Then another. And another. He glanced at the screen, his expression flickering, the mask slipping just slightly. Around the room, others' phones began buzzing as the news broke. Real estate mogul Dorian Corwin under federal investigation for fraud and property laundering. The room erupted. Whispers like wildfire, heads turning, fingers pointing. Dorian's face flushed crimson as he fumbled through his speech. "This is slander, an attack on my family's good name. That was when the agents walked in. Federal agents, calm, authoritative, with papers in hand. They served him a subpoena right there under the crystal glow of his carefully crafted empire. Cameras flashed. Someone filmed as Dorian's voice cracked into a furious outburst. Exactly the image of the powerful man unraveling that I wanted the world to see. I didn't stay to watch the full collapse. I didn't need to. As I walked out, Alaric called my name, but I kept going. For once, I didn't feel small or silenced or invisible. For the first time in years, Dorian wasn't untouchable, and I wasn't invisible. But when the dust settled, I had to face what I'd lost and what I'd gained. My new apartment was small, a one-bedroom on the 8th floor overlooking Boston Harbor. From my window, I could see the ferries crawling across the gray water, gulls swooping low like they owned the place. It was quiet here, too quiet at first, the kind of silence that forces you to notice what's missing. For weeks, I'd been running on adrenaline. Now there was just stillness. I sat at the edge of my bed that morning, barefoot, staring at the boxes I hadn't unpacked. My life reduced to cardboard and tape. My phone was on the nightstand, screen lighting up with notifications I ignored. There was a time I would have reached for it immediately, bracing for Dorian's next move, for Alaric's clipped texts, for whatever storm they'd decide to unleash. But now I let it buzz. They weren't my storms anymore. Later that day, I met Marjorie at her office for what she called the final wrap-up. She was in good spirits, which meant she had news worth hearing. She didn't waste time. Dorian's empire is in freefall, she said, handing me a printed report. Fraud charges, property seizures, investigations piling up faster than his lawyers can spin them. The restraining order officially dismissed as of this morning. He's done, Calliope. Done. The word felt heavier than I expected. I thought I'd feel triumphant, but all I felt was tired. Marjorie leaned back in her chair, studying me. You know, she said softly, it's okay to grieve even when you've won. I nodded. She was right. I'd burned down the house that held me hostage, but I'd lived in it for years. My scars wouldn't vanish just because his walls had crumbled. Thank you, I told her, my voice catching more than I wanted it to, for helping me find my voice when I thought I didn't have one anymore. Her expression softened. You found it yourself. I just reminded you how loud it could be. 2 days later, Alaric asked to meet. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We chose a quiet cafe tucked into a corner of Cambridge, the kind of place where no one cared who we were. He was already there when I arrived, hands clasped, staring into a cup of coffee that had probably gone cold. He looked smaller somehow, like the weight of his family's disgrace had finally settled on him. Calliope, he said as I sat down. I'm sorry. I let the words hang between us, waiting. I was scared, he continued, voice low, scared of losing everything. My career, my family. I convinced myself staying silent was protecting us. I see now how wrong that was. I wanted to believe him. Part of me still ached for the man I thought he was. But then I remembered the night in the ballroom. Blood on my lip, his voice telling me to apologize to the man who hit me. He reached for my hand. Can we rebuild? Start over. I pulled back gently, shaking my head. I'm done rebuilding things that were never safe for me in the first place. His face crumpled, but I didn't stay to comfort him. I stood, left a few dollars on the table, and walked out. On my way home, I stopped by the harbor. The wind was sharp, cutting through my coat, but I stayed there for a long time, watching the water. I remembered how small I once felt in Dorian's world, how hard I tried to fit into a space that was never meant for me. I don't need that world anymore. That night, back in my apartment, I sent Marjorie a text. Thank you for helping me burn it all down. Now I can finally build something new. I set the phone down, curled up by the window, and breathed in the salt air. The ashes of their empire weren't my burden anymore. They were my freedom. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between staying quiet or fighting back, no matter the cost? Tell me what you think, I really want to know.